Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at CPA Academy. So excited to have Janat and Megan here for Inclusive Leadership, part of the D&I series of webinars. I'll be handing it over just one moment. Before I do, we're going to do a few housekeeping items. So make sure everything's working for you, the audience. Make sure audio is coming through. We'll let you know how to use that questions pane. Ask questions, make comments. We'll let you know about your handout. And of course, we'll let you know about your CPE. So let's get started. If you wouldn't mind drawing your attention over to that GoToWebinar control panel. It's usually on the right side of your screen. There's a questions pane. Many people are already typing in, letting me know where they are joining us from. So if you hadn't already, please say hello. Let me know where you're joining us from. Let me know the audio is coming through. Have you attended a Janat course in the past? And then, of course, during the session, if you do have any questions, please post them in here. If there's time, they'll do some Q&A, and we'll also be sending Janat a full report with all your questions a little bit later today. There's a handout available for this course as well. We made that file available in your account at cpaacademy.org, and you can also click on that file, the PDF, in the handouts pane and follow along. This is a 1-hour course eligible for 1 CPE. In order to get that credit, you need to do 2 things: attend this full session and answer the polling questions. Those polls are going to be launched periodically. You just need to select the radio button that best fits your answer, submit, and you're good to go. We'll do our best to get your credit processed a little later today. You should see it in your account by tomorrow. We'll also be recording this session. We'll send you that archive link a little bit later today. And at the end of this course, we'll send you an email with a link to fill out a quick survey. Let us know how the webinar went. Let us know how we're doing here at CPA Academy. We love getting your feedback and encourage you to fill that out. So let me check in with the audience. Hello, audience. Thank you for joining us. We've got Marjorie in Green Bay, Bobby in Atlanta. We got Floyd in Florida, Colorado, Louisville, Indianapolis, people from all over. Looks like things are working well. And that is my cue to step aside. So Janat, Megan, thank you so much for being here today. Our audience is ready, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nathan. Hello, and welcome everyone to another edition of D&I One-on-One. I have the pleasure today of talking with Meagan Pollock. And so Meagan and I met on Facebook, actually, through a Facebook group that D&I practitioners are members of. And I wanted to talk with somebody about inclusive leadership, and she raised her hand. So Meagan is an engineer turned DEI consultant. And so we are kindred spirits because I'm a CPA turned DEI consultant. So we're co-conspirators in this space. She's going to be talking to us today about inclusive leadership. But Meagan, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and why this conversation was important to you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm based out of Dallas, Texas. And yeah, so I am an engineer by training, so I learned to think about systems and order and process and efficiency. And about 12 years ago, I switched from widgets to workshops, and I never turned back. And you know, when I left industry, I worked for Texas Instruments, and my goal was to do something that changed the way that women and people of color had access to engineering. And so I worked on my doctorate to focus just on that. And so for the last decade or so, I've been doing professional development for educators and people in the workforce, thinking about inclusive environments. I've worked a lot in education about thinking about how do we change the learning environment so that every person feels welcome and that they belong and that they can succeed. And it's really shifted over the last year, thinking about leadership, right? And, you know, one of the things, the key parts of my work is to empower everyone to feel like they are that leader, right? And so even though, you know, we're talking about leadership and sometimes people think like, that's not me, I'm not a leader. What we want to encourage everyone to recognize is that we are all have the capacity to be leaders within our circle of influence, and empower all of us to be the change and lead the change. So that's what I wanted to talk about today.
So you started an organization or company called Engineer Inclusion, and I love the name. And I think one of the things you wanted to share with us, and maybe we jump into it, is at the very beginning, you have this, this is your process. Do you want to walk us through what this means, what this stands for?
Yeah, sure. So this is our inclusive leadership development model, and it's going to be published this fall in a book specifically for engineering leadership development. And you know, the flow here is recognizing first that for each and every one of us, if you want to be an inclusive leader, it all starts with us, right? And there's you know, what inclusive leadership really means is it's how are we creating space for where people feel like they belong and that they can be themselves. And for us as individuals, we have to really look in, and there's so much self-awareness that's a part of this work. And learning how the brain works and learning how our brain holds biases and how our brain holds stereotypes, because there are specific neural networks in the brain that are responsible for these things, and they manifest and come out through our communication and through our actions, and many times when we don't even know that it's happening. And it's our responsibility, if we want to be an inclusive leader, is that we have to have that awareness of our own biases. And then the next part is, we're always looking in, but we have to learn how to look out and see the world in an expanded view. One of the key pieces here is learning to think systemically. And so what that means is that we have to learn to see and acknowledge that there are systems of advantage and systems of a disadvantage, right? There are institutionalized ways that oppression has, perpetuated in our country and across the globe. And so learning, to develop that lens is learning to see the world in a new way. I like to think of it as sort of like Superman's sort of X-ray vision, where you can look into the walls of your system, into the walls of your organization, and see what barriers and supports are there, who is getting those supports, and who doesn't have what they need to be successful. And it is a skill to develop that lens, and it's something that you practice. And as you move through life, with different sort of intersections of identity, you begin to develop an expanded lens against different kinds of things. The second piece to that is certainly recognizing that there's an ethics issue here. And as a leader, our job should be to create environments where everyone can be successful. And if we aren't creating environments where everyone can be successful, there's an ethics issue there, right? And excuse me. And so we want to help people really understand and develop that, sort of passion for increased awareness. And awareness is wonderful, but it is absolutely not enough, right? You can read all the books in the world, but if you don't do anything, if we don't change, if we don't push anything and move anything forward, we are complicit in all of those issues. And so that moves us to the practices, the first gear there. And, I like to think of this as, inclusive leadership is a practice, because you are constantly putting into practice new strategies, new skills that create effective collaboration, that drive those outcomes that we're looking at on the far right in the pink ear. But, having this sort of human-centered approach is, there's this quote that I love, and I want to read it to you. And it's from by Richard Buchanan. And he says and so the human-centered approach comes from like the human-centered design thinking. And since I'm an engineer, and that's where it comes from. He writes, human-centered design is fundamentally an affirmation of human dignity. It's an ongoing search for what one can do to support and strengthen the dignity of human beings as they act out their lives in varied social, economic, political, and cultural circumstances. So just like the Stanford model for design leads with empathy, we must also intentionally lead with empathy, curiosity, and open-mindedness to strengthen the dignity of all of the humans around us. And then the second piece to that practice is being an accountable lifelong learner. And what that means is that, the standard given here is that we're all human and we're all going to make mistakes. And what that means is that we have to be accountable when we do make those mistakes, and really avoid being defensive if someone invites us to understand something that we maybe didn't know. And so, what we often see is people who are so well-intentioned, and, someone voices their concern and someone says, yeah, but I meant this. Well, the best way to receive that is to be like, wow, thank you for that feedback. Thank you for telling me what, how you experienced that. I'm going to change, and I'm going to figure out a new way to do that. And then the last piece is when we're regularly implementing things, it's driving the outcomes of communication and collaboration. And when we have effective communication and we have effective collaboration, it gives us all those great business outcomes that we want too, right? But it also creates a space, again, going back to why this matters is it helps people feel like they belong, and it helps people feel like they can still be themselves. And this increases, participation, it increases attendance, increases, engagement and creativity. And so we want our employees to have all of those kinds of joys and feelings as they're working. And so that, again, is sort of the framework for how I think about inclusive leadership. And this is completely iterative, right? Like, you are never done. You're going to keep going and keep learning and expanding and growing and practicing different things, and maybe making mistakes, or definitely making mistakes, and then owning those mistakes and continuing to move forward.
So I think this is a good time, Nathan, to launch the first poll, because as we start talking more about what it means, maybe this is the time to find out how familiar everyone is.
Oh, okay.
Perfect. And thank you so much. We've launched that poll. Are you familiar with the term inclusive leadership? We'll leave that up for about a minute.
When people were joining and chopping in the cities they were from, I saw Albuquerque, which brought a smile to my face because I have a lot of family out there. And I saw Raleigh, which is a place I wanted to move to. And then I changed jobs and I never did. But it's amazing to see people coming from all over the place, even from the Caribbean. So welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here with us today. My hometown's in Maryland. I don't know, Megan, what's your hometown or state?
I'm from Texas. My hometown is Orange, Texas.
Orange is my favorite color, so I think we have a lot in common. All right, I see we have about 10 seconds left. And then Nathan, when the results come in, could you push those out, share those?
No problem. All right, last couple seconds. We will close and share those results.
Good. So it looks like many of you have already heard of the term, and that's good. Excellent.
Yeah. So, let's talk about then. So we hear this a lot. We hear the term inclusive leader. So many organizations are trying to offer training on it, or setting an expectation that leaders are going to be inclusive. But can you just do that? Can you just go to somebody down the street and say, all right, Bob, you're a manager here. I want you to be inclusive. Like, it doesn't work that way. So can you talk to us about, so when you hear the term inclusive leader, if somebody out there is listening to that term, what should come to mind?
Yeah, well, so it's definitely not a switch that you can sort of turn on. It's absolutely a skill that you practice and develop, just like leadership is, right? Like, leadership's not a skill that you just necessarily turn on. In the same way that we learn to be good leaders and managers, you can learn to be a good inclusive leader. And the outcomes is what's driving this conversation, right? Like, we want people to feel like they belong. We want people to feel like they can show up to work and be their whole authentic self. And in order for us to do that, it means that we're certainly treating people with dignity and respect. It means that everyone has a voice and that their voice is heard, right? It's one thing to have a seat at the table. It's a very different one to have a seat at the table and then have your voice be heard, right? And it's a space where there is true equity in how we divide up any kind of resources, whether that's money, whether that's projects. It's being really thoughtful to, equity by definition is, removing barriers and adding supports so that everyone has what they need to be successful. And in some ways, equity is also seen as a sort of function of fairness, right? And what we can use that as a benchmark as a leader too, is like, how is what I'm doing, being fair and leveling the playing field for my employees and for my team, or for those people around me in my community, right? Like, the practices that you employ can be as simple as listening, right? How many of you learned how to listen? Like, really listen and to hear people. It means that you're not defensive, that you accept feedback and can hear feedback and respond to feedback. It means that you are, engaging with people in a really respectful way. If you're in an environment where people yell a lot, that's not an inclusive space, right? Like, it's so much about this is about the environment in which people work. And that goes for virtual organizations. I've been a virtual employee for, a virtual worker for 12 years. And what worked for a full virtual organization, and it has its own culture too. And so the culture and climate, as an inclusive leader, you're a guardian of that environment, and you're paying attention to what's happening in that space so that the dominant group, and so my background's in engineering, and so women only represent about 10 to 15% of engineers in the workforce. So the dominant group is going to be men, right? And so if the culture of the group is so dominated by by men and the culture of men, right? I see a couple of nods in the chat, if hey, from Texas and whatnot. So like my team, when I worked at TI, like we were all from Texas Tech. And so there was like a huge football love on the team. And we all had to, I grew up watching football because that's what Texans do, right? But I never watched TV before. Like I didn't have time, I was in school. But in order for me to like have a conversation with my colleagues, I had to watch all the dumb football games. I had to start watching The Office and start watching TV just to have any way to be a part of that team, right? And why I offer that is what happens is the dominant culture was driving the space so much. And so I, as the outsider, had to assimilate and try to like force myself to plug in. If we're an inclusive leader, we're really paying attention to that. So it's less of like, Meagan, you just do what we do, and asking, well, Meagan, what is it that you do, and how do you bring that to the space, right?
I mean, that's that's something that I think a lot of people don't think about, because an inclusive leader, I think for a lot of people who, if their organization hasn't done work in this space, if their organization hasn't even explored the fundamentals of D&I, then they hear the concept inclusive leader, and that just means in meetings, everybody gets to talk.
No.
And you made a point, I actually wrote it down. You talked about listening and listening to feedback, but nobody wants to be in a conversation where they're not heard. Nobody wants to be ignored, none of us. And so as a leader, letting people know that you're considering what they say, it doesn't mean you're going to do what they say. It doesn't even necessarily mean you agree. It just means you were heard. I mean, that's a real simple thing. I mean, and my career's in public accounting, which is, these days there are a lot of women, but it's still predominantly white. And what you were just saying is that in any organization, the social norms, the interactive norms, and the behaviors day to day that are tolerated, expected, and preferred are all based around and designed by the majority group. So in your profession, it was men. And in my profession, it's more race than gender. So it's interesting that you said that. And then the other thing you said, if you could go back to it, is you said, having a seat at the table but not being heard. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because a lot of people think, well, there are minorities in leadership. There are women in leadership. The problem has been solved. If they're there, then everybody's included, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, Janelle, how many times have you been at a boardroom table? So you literally have a seat at the table. You share an opinion, and then and everyone's like, but like just keeps moving on. And then someone else from the dominant group says the same thing with like a little twist, and everyone's like, yes, that's it. We're gonna go with that. And I'm like, what just
Didn't
happened
I just say
here?
that? Yeah.
Ever happened to you? Yeah. And so that's part of this, right? Like, they heard what you said, they didn't hear what you said. And so that's a really big difference. And just because someone is, put into a position of power, if they're not given the respect, if they're not given a budget, if they're not given a team, it could set them up for failure, right? And again, to have an inclusive space, it's more than just like the function of diversity, right? Like, we've got heads. So you can have women, and you can have people of color, and you can have people from the LGBTQI community. But if they don't feel valued, if they don't feel like they belong, if they don't feel like they can show up and be themselves, first of all, they're not going to stay, right? This is why women leave the sciences and the masses, because of this sort of sense of like not belonging. And it's a choice to go and to do something where they can have those sense of belonging. But it's like, let me think of an example. So maybe you think of an example when you're a kid and your parents say like, what does everyone want to do? Everybody gets opinions and they're like, we're going to do this. We're going to do what I want to do, right? Mm-hmm. So you had a voice, your voice was heard, but it didn't matter, right? Like it didn't matter what you thought because no one was going to do anything about it, right? And an inclusive leader doesn't do that, right? Like you take in the opinions, it doesn't mean that everything has to be a collective decision. That's not what being an inclusive leader means. But it does mean that the people around you have agency, they have choice, right. And they have some skin in the game because you've involved them in the direction that you're going, right? It's not just you standing in the front marching forward, that you're, leading and shepherding in a way that everyone's included in that direction.
And, what you just said is that they heard me, but they didn't listen to me. Or wait, no, the other way around. They were listening, but they didn't hear me.
Right.
And I guess I would want to make it clear that you're not saying that as an inclusive leader, I've got 10 people on my team. I'm listening to the things 10 people say, and somehow I've got to incorporate what everybody says into what we're doing.
No.
It's more like I want to make sure that everybody on my team is heard, that I've demonstrated that I'm listening, and that if whatever the final solution is or the decision is made, honoring that everyone's input was considered.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, what I'm definitely not saying is that everybody has to be involved in every decision. Like that's inefficient. Doesn't make any sense.
It's impractical.
Yeah, it's definitely impractical. But if you are making decisions, you do want to make sure that you have people involved in those decisions that are diverse, right? Like you don't want to have all of one group of people making decisions for everyone, because you need that diversity of thought, right? And so to me, being an inclusive leader means that I'm really intentional about how I craft teams. I'm really intentional about how I scaffold lots of different things so that I have lots of different voices and ideas and ways of knowing and doing involved in those things, because that's going to give us a richer solution, right? And it's not putting one group of people in the position of like, you need to read everyone's mind when you know nothing about them, and just share no lived experiences with them.
Right. It's funny. I wrote down a note from something you said, and I am desperately trying to read my own handwriting, and it's an epic fail. So we're going to skip that.
Okay.
So I do have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
There are organizations that aren't particularly diverse. They might have homogenous teams, and they're working on diversity, and that's okay. I acknowledge that this is a journey. We can't just randomly create more diverse organizations. So if I'm in an organization that's predominantly women or predominantly people of color, predominantly white, do I have to worry about being an inclusive leader if everybody looks like me?
Well, first of all, just because you think everyone looks like you doesn't mean everyone is like you, right? The common sort of way of thinking about people is we are icebergs. What you see of a person is just a little tip of who they are. You don't know all of the big, icy block that's underneath the water line. I sat in a workshop once with a group of educators, and a person said, yeah, but we're all white here. And I look around, and we weren't all white in that room. And I looked particularly at the two women of color who were there, and I could see how he could assume that they were white because they had light skin and could pass as white. And their faces were just like, they felt immediately erased, right? And unseen in that space. And so first of all, that's the one mistake that we can make, is assuming that we're all the same. The second mistake that can be made there is like majority rules, right? And if you say the majority rules is because we're all here, then that is not an inclusive leadership decision, right? And, I think about, particularly in places where people are marginalized and underrepresented. And, if I'm 1 in 10, men if I'm one woman out of 10 men in a room, and think about literally as like a margin, as like a boundary, right? And they all make a circle, because that's the majority rules. Like, we're going to circle and function like this. I have to keep like trying to like wedge in,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so that's literally like not the definition of inclusion. So the definition of inclusion would be like, how do we expand that circle
Mm-hmm.
and make it, you know, permeable, literally permeable, so that it's amorphous and everybody sort of fits into the space, you know? If all of your functions that you do as a team are sports based, and I have been an athlete my whole life until I broke my back, but you know, and I was guilty of that too. Like we had lots of, all the things I would do were very sports based. I remember when I defended my dissertation, one of my advisors in the end, she's like, I just want you to know you had like 8 sports references in a 45-minute presentation. And so like that's not necessarily inclusive, right? Because for people who aren't sports people, you're not engaging them in different, and you're not bringing in different ways of thinking. So being an inclusive leader is about not majority rules, not we're all the same. It's really opening it up and saying, let's try something new. Hey, why don't, Gina, why don't you bring something, you know, you lead this activity. The next person, you lead this activity. And that gives them space to bring their self, their identity, their culture to the table. And so, yeah, we're not all the same, even if it looks like it.
So Angela dropped in the Q&A a statement, basically. I want your opinion, but I'm not going to tell you what that opinion should be. And so I think, Angela, what she was referring to is something you were talking about earlier in terms of listening, that the inclusive leader isn't going to say, I want to hear you, but this is the only thing I want to hear.
Okay.
I'm guessing that's what that means. Maybe, Angela, if I missed it wrong, drop in another question and then we'll get that straight.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's,
Yes.
I get that a lot. I know in some of my past work experiences, I've had a boss sit down with me. We're talking about something. He asks for my input. And in this case, it was a he. So he asked for my input. I give my input. And it wasn't what he was expecting to hear. So it was immediately dismissed. And it seemed to me that he was fishing for me to say, yes, I agree with what you think. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result, I don't know if it was a question of inclusion when I was looking at it, when I look at it in hindsight, so much as a question of feeling empowered. And you suggested something about empowerment earlier. I don't remember if you specifically used that word, but I remember hearing about empowering others on your team, which doesn't necessarily mean everybody becomes the decision maker. Everybody, though, has opportunity.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, to be an inclusive leader definitely means that you're empowering your team, that you're giving, again, it depends on the industry for sure, but like you definitely don't want to be leading a team where people don't feel empowered, you know, like the opposite of empowered means like, you know, squashed, you know,
Yes.
and so like they have no voice and like they have no opportunity to contribute. That would feel terrible, right? Like nobody wants to feel that. And so if you're not creating a space where, you know, people around you feel able to speak up and able to contribute and able to show up and present themselves in a way that's authentic to who they are, then that's definitely not the goal for inclusive leadership.
Do you think everybody can be trained to be an inclusive leader? That everybody with training can become this model of leadership?
Yes. I mean, I think anybody who wants to, you know, I wouldn't be in this work if I wasn't hopeful that people could learn and grow and change. Do I think that some people have a long journey? Sure, right? Like, you know, if you're in a space where you are reticent to change, that if you're actively denying systems of oppression, you know, if you are actively in a space of like not acknowledging that privilege is a thing, like you can move from that into being an inclusive leader, but it's just gonna be a little bit more work for you because you have a lot of learning to do to sort of unpack and literally kind of unravel the way that you've been taught and continue to think, you know, but everyone has the capacity to move to this, you know, and these are really good human skills too, by the way, right? Like where you want people who are around you to feel valued and respected. You want people to feel like they belong. You want to, you know, being an inclusive leader is being a humble person and, admitting when you make mistakes. That's a really key, big piece to this. If you are constantly never taking responsibility for issues, that is not inclusive leadership, right? Inclusive leaders are humble, they admit mistakes and demonstrate how to grow from them. And you create space for other people to do the same.
But before you keep going there, let's find out. I'm curious. There's a poll question 3. Actually, we'll jump down. Can we launch that one, Nathan? Because it's talking exactly about this type of learning.
This is the inclusive leadership training.
Yeah.
We're launching that now. Leave that up for about a minute.
I thought, Meagan, that'd be a good question to ask right now, because I know I'm seeing and I'm hearing more requests for that as well in my practice, and which makes me wonder how many organizations are starting to do this more and more. By the way, Angela did respond and say that the way I interpreted her question was right, and then she followed up with a comment that says, "quote unquote, women always think," and then that's sort of the box we're put in terms of asking questions and getting responses. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and any kind of phrasing like that, and we're all still guilty of using things like that, but you don't want to speak in sweeping generalizations, using terms like this group always does this, or because we know that perpetuates stereotypes, and inclusive leaders don't. They are consciously trying to challenge those stereotypes about any intersectional identity.
So I see the results, and it's 33% yes and 48% no.
Okay, that's a lot higher than I would have imagined.
Exactly. I'm encouraged by that. Like you, you have to be an eternal optimist to do this work, I think. But that's great to hear. So it validates what I've been saying, that there's more of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are a couple questions in here. This one might be a good time for it. So Joseph is asking, do you oftentimes find it is women who feel like they aren't listened to? I supervise employees, I'm male, 2 of which are female. How can I tell if I am not listening to them?
So there's a great acronym that I like to use, and it's called HERE. Let's see if I can remember it. So H means halt, so stop, right? And stop and be ready to engage with what someone is about to say. Let's see if I can pull it up. I just taught this morning. I want to make sure I get it right. Okay, yeah. So first is to stop and make sure that you are fully engaged with someone. If you're on your phone, if you're doing something else, you're not going to hear what somebody's saying. The next is E, so HE, is to engage. Make sure that you are fully engaged with the person so that you can hear them, whether that means that you're nodding and you're able to hear what they're doing. The A is to anticipate. Now, this doesn't mean anticipate a space to fill in your response.
Right.
It means that you are sort of anticipating how to learn something from what they are offering you, right? Like you need to listen as if you might be wrong, listen as if you might learn something, anticipate that you're going to gain something from what this person is saying. Curiosity. And then the R is to replay. So I hear you saying this. Is that right? Right? So if you're not replaying what you think that you're hearing, then you're never going to know if it's somewhat wrong. And that gives them a space to respond and say, no, let me clarify this, right? And so that's one strategy for listening.
Oh, that's a great model. I'm going to have to steal that.
I can give you the citation for it. I didn't come up with it.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. So I'm sitting here scanning through the questions. They're coming in faster than I can get to it. I haven't read this whole thing, so I'm going to read it, and I hope it all comes together. So Headspace is a good way to have a proper mindset. They have a quote. I think she's talking about the app, maybe?
Yeah.
They have a quote at the end of each session, like, quote, as we see ourselves more clearly, we start to see others more clearly too, seeing them as they are rather than how we thought they were. And then, so that's the quote. It's a great way to be calm and program your thinking each day? Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, so I think what Karen's talking about is there's an app called Headspace and different kinds of things. And that's a great point, right? Like, you know, the more clearly we can see others, the more clearly we can see ourselves, the more clearly we can see others. One of the workshops that I teach is on self-awareness for social justice. And really it's about, you know, looking in the mirror. And because if we don't understand ourselves, if we don't understand our own lived experiences and how that biases our perception and how it changes how we move through the world, then we can't fully understand and look out and serve others, right? So we have to build that own knowledge, that own self-awareness, so that we can then look out and expand that view and take action towards change.
So another comment here, isn't diversity of thought and experience as opposed to demographics, which are outside of one's control?
Yeah, I mean, diversity, like by definition, means variety, right? Most of the time when we hear the term diversity, it does mean like, you know, different racial, gender, you know, different demographics, you know, around that kind of thing. But diversity also means, you know, ways of thinking. It means, you know, neurotypical kinds of things as well. You can have diversity in, you know, like where you were raised, Southerners versus, you know, Northerners. You can have diversity in like Myers-Briggs, right? Like one of the things that we did in industry is the Myers-Briggs, and like some massive amount of engineers are like ISTJs. So that's like the one on the very far end. And I am an ENFP, so like 16 points away from them, right? Like, so there's value in that diversity of having different approaches to a problem. And so, you know, if you're in a position of hiring, then yes, you want to look for, it is important that we look for gender and racial diversity in our hiring, because that is how we begin to really create equitable choices in our hiring. But yeah, diversity by definition is just variety, different ways of thinking, knowing, and doing.
Yeah, I mean, and I love that question because too often I know I hear people think that while race is important and gender is important, we really need to have a more meaningful diversity conversation looking at all categories. And I try to make the point that all of that diversity is valuable and important, but we don't want to forget the groups that have been historically marginalized, isolated, or underrepresented. It's not an either or, it's an and.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an and statement. All right, so I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that we get all the polling questions in. So maybe we do the second one now, John, and then Nathan, and then we'll hold the last one till the end.
Sounds good. We've launched the poll. Does your organization measure inclusion? Leave that up for about a minute.
I saw a report, Megan, by Better Up. I don't know if you saw that, that they were trying to do this to measure inclusion. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, is that quantifiable once the poll is closed?
Are you ready for me to answer, or are we waiting?
I'm waiting. I want to wait till the answers come in. Catherine is an INFJ. Thank you, Catherine. It's funny, the DISC profile, I'm in the accounting profession. That was the one I think I got at work, and I did Myers-Briggs on my own. Just looking, I'm scrolling through the questions here while that's open.
All right, we'll give everybody a few more seconds, and I'll close and share.
So this is really interesting. 31% said their company does measure inclusion. So, okay, now you can share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so any question that's dealing with, you know, sort of people can be hard to measure, right? Like, because it's actually qualitative research. You can quantitatively gather that data, but it's still going to be skewed based on how I think I'm supposed to answer. And we could be unconsciously doing that in how we answer things. You know, inclusion, it's the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise have been excluded or marginalized. And so you can ask people, so you can measure that, right? So you can measure your effort to, you know, and the policies that you're putting into place. So that can absolutely be measured, right? Like our affirmative action, you know, and being intentional in your hiring, our hiring committees diverse, like those are all like numbered things that you can gather data and measure and create metrics and performance indicators for. But when if you're talking about belonging, like, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like I include? That is something that you can certainly pull for as well. And I always caution for organizations who are going to do that, because a lot of times they do these big surveys, and too often they do these surveys, but they don't do anything with it. And that, as if a person is from a marginalized or excluded, you know, population in that space, that's like a big slap in the face. Like, please tell us how you feel, and oh, now we know that you don't feel like you belong, and like, and we don't know what to do now, right? So if you're going to be asking, you know, for that sort of quantitative sense of a feeling, you got to be ready to do something with it on the end. And so, you know, you can create these metrics and you can track them. And so to that degree, yes, you can do that. But if you're talking about belonging, it is different.
I saw a study come out when I was referencing by BetterUp, and they were trying to quantify inclusion. And I think that the way they did it, they were asking if people felt like they belonged. And then if the answer was yes, then they asked them a series of other questions, which I'm not sure that is a statistically valid way of going about it. But for example, they were asking like, how many sick days did you take last year, kind of thing. And then they could see what percentage of people took sick days and how that compared to how much they felt like they belonged. Does that make sense?
Well, the thing about belonging isn't a totally conscious thing, right? So if you would ask me when I was 26 in industry, like if I felt like I belonged, of course I was going to tell you yes. Like, I'd worked really hard to get there. Of course I belonged there. And even if you would have asked me, do I feel like I belong? I would have said yes, because I'm really good at playing the part. I'm really good at doing all these things to fit in. But what's interesting is when I left industry and then I came back in for a consulting gig, it was like, it was shocking to me, because I had been out for a few years and I didn't realize, I was like a fish out of water at that point, right? Because I'd been so immersed in that environment that when I left and I came back and I was like, you know what? Like, I'm good. I don't need this. I can go be myself somewhere else.
Right.
But because that's a hard thing to measure, right? Because you've got people who are in that space and who are going to do whatever it takes for them to do the job that they love. But it wasn't until I was fish out of water and then came back and was like, yeah, this isn't my water anymore, you know, and this isn't the home that I want. And so that's a really kind of hard thing to measure, because, you know, our pride and our intention and all of these things can sort of overshadow, and even the sort of way in which you engage and assimilate and try to survive in those spaces affects the sort of truth of the matter, right? Like,
well, I would add to that. I know that the whole bring yourself to work thing, the whole be your authentic self, part of what's important there is I get to decide what that is. And so that doesn't mean that if I don't bring everything to work, that somehow I'm being inauthentic. It just means I'm being myself, means I'm allowed to just decide how I'm going to show up at work. And I might choose to hold some things back because it will make me feel more comfortable for a number of reasons, as well as maybe fit in better. That doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing.
Yeah, and of course, it doesn't mean all of us have to be, you know, big wide open books. Yeah, that's definitely not what it means. But it should mean that I could show up in a way in some other way, that by doing that, it's not going to isolate me and exclude me from the group.
Sorry, I hope that sound wasn't coming through.
I didn't hear anything.
Good, because I live in Maryland, and sometimes we're on the flight path from Andrews Air Force Base, and there are some very big planes that are like thundering as they go overhead. It's quite impressive. All right, I'm looking at the clock. Let me try to scroll through the Q&A and see what's in here. Oh, so
There's a
Catherine
great
said,
question.
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say there's a question from Aaron about talking about the difference between equity and equality.
Yeah, go ahead and
And
bring it up. I'm trying to keep up. So go ahead. What's the question say?
so equality is the goal, right? Equality is where everyone has literally equal access to healthcare and pay and all the kinds of sort of social benefits that exist, right? It's true equal access to marriage and to jobs. And equity is how we get there, right? It's the actual intention of leveling the playing field. So when we have legislation that's passed, the things that protect people with disabilities, the civil rights, like those are acts of equity that are trying to step us up closer to equality. It doesn't mean we're there, right? It means that we have to keep adding these sort of legislative steps, but the legislative steps to get to equality, they're not enough, right? Because the systems are huge.
Mm-hmm.
And systems meaning like we are all part of the system and we all uphold the systems, right? And so equality is the goal and equity is how we level the playing field so that everyone can reach those levels of equity, right? So equality would mean 50% women, 50% men in engineering. Equality would mean, if there 13, 14% Black people in the country, that means that 13 to 14% of engineers are Black, right? So like that's equality and that there are equal numbers of in the field. But equity are this particular efforts that are made to reach that point. And then the second part of the question is, should the focus be on equal opportunity or getting a percentage mix? So equal opportunity is kind of a tricky word, right? Because it's like saying, hey, everyone, the door's open.
Yes.
You get to come in, you get to come in, you get to come in. But what we don't see is that the door what's between you and the door, Aaron, to enter might not be the same thing that's between me and the door, right? Like I might have a shark pit and, a mountain to climb and a vast desert that I have to walk through to get to that equal opportunity door because of the implications of the lack of equality that's been structured within our country. And so equal opportunity is a really kind of dangerous way of looking at it because of the barriers that equity is then designed to provide a leveling of that playing field. It's meant to reduce those barriers and add supports to help people get to the same direction. Hopefully that answers your question.
I love that example you just gave. My husband is the director for a vocational center, and the goal of the vocational center is to get people jobs who are either about to become homeless or recovering from homelessness. And one of the things that he talks about is exactly what you're saying, that what we don't necessarily recognize when you talk about an open door is for those who can get to and through that door easily, there is a blind spot that might not be true for others. And so the fact that there's a blind spot doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just falls into the you don't know what you don't know category. So for example, I will say I was unaware of some of the simple challenges that my husband's clients face. They can get a job, but if they don't have childcare, they can't get to the job. And there's a particular, in the county where I live, you have to have the job to get the childcare, but the people need the childcare to get the job. It's a bit of a catch-22. And that was my blind spot. And I'll acknowledge that. And I think that, so understanding blind spots is a really good place to start, but you can't know what you don't know until you do some of the training that we've been talking about doing.
Yeah, for sure.
So do you think you could, I don't know if this is possible, but do you think you could run down some attributes? Like if I had my notebook out and I wanted to write down what are the attributes I should have to be an inclusive leader, does such a list exist?
Yeah, it does. There's a great Harvard Business Review article, and I think it's by Bork, Bourke, and Esposito. It's 2019, and they give you a handy 6-point list. And that list is, first, it's visible commitment. So it means that you clearly articulate and you just say, like, I'm committed to this. The second one is humility. So you're modest about your capabilities, you admit mistakes, you create space for others to make mistakes. The third is awareness of bias. So you show awareness of personal blind spots and flaws in the system, and you work hard to ensure that people are appropriately rewarded for their efforts and contributions. The fourth is curiosity about others. So you demonstrate an open mindset and deep curiosity about others. You listen without judgment and with empathy to seek to understand those around you. The fifth one is cultural intelligence. It means that you're attentive to others' cultures and you adapt your environments, policies, your events to be intentionally welcoming and respectful of all cultures. And then the sixth one is effective collaboration. So you empower others, you pay attention to the diversity of thinking and psychological safety, and you focus on team cohesion.
I promise everybody that we did not script that.
No, we didn't.
Because it's like I asked you the question, you're like, yes, there's an article, and you start looking at it. That was not planted. Can somebody be an inclusive leader? They have all those attributes. They are committed to fostering inclusion, and yet their organization isn't doing anything about D&I.
Oh, sure, right? Like you can be canary in a coal mine, right? Like you can be the one thing that sort of brings attention to all of these efforts. You know, change happens in many different ways. And just because you might be in an organization that's not paying attention to this adequately or enough or yet, doesn't mean that you can't engage with some of these principles and lead with these principles. So yeah, the only barrier to us doing that is ourselves and the choice that we take to practice some of these things. Yeah, for sure.
What are some, so now looking at the questions, it's 3:51. So what are some practical programs companies are implementing as part of developing a DEI strategy? Are there best-in-class companies doing this other than listening and the soft things?
Well, there is an explosion of companies that do this training for this. You know, Jana is a company, my company does this, and there's plenty of work to go around for sure. You know, what it takes is it's like a sandwiched method, right? Like one is there's this big awareness piece of you have to help people understand their own identities and build those lenses, right? And then help them learn to move through that continuum of the model that I showed you of practicing to driving those outcomes. But yet you also have to look at the system, right? Because changing individuals and like what happens between me and you isn't enough. Like I have to be able to take this and change the systems, look at policies and look into see, you know, what are the policies that you have in your organization around hiring, around culture, and, you know, around, you know, any kind of punitive discipline kinds of things. Are your policies supporting diverse cultures and diverse ways of knowing and doing, or are they aligned with the dominant sort of, you know, ways of knowing and doing? And so you have to change the systems and you have to help people build their own lens. And then when that comes together, then you've got this sort of mash of organizational change principles right. And how that moves forward and rolls out. It also really requires, for effective change in an organization, is it takes buy-in, right? Like I could come in and give you a script, but that's not going to lead change, right? The best change happens through a facilitated process where the people feel empowered to drive that. And so, you know, you want to look for organizations that are prepared to coach you through that journey and have the skills and have the knowledge to know where they need you to go. But they're not just going to give you the answer, because what works in one place isn't going to work in another, right? And I can give you all these programs, but if you're, you know, it's rooted in self-efficacy and, you know, agency. Like if your team doesn't want to implement the thing I just created, because I just told you to do it, then it's never going to change. Right. But if I tell you and coach you through a model of knowing, like, this is what we need to get to, and I'm going to teach you all these things, and then you have this aha moment of this is the intervention we're going to create and we're excited about it, then you're going to drive that, and then that's going to lead change, and it's going to be much more sustainable.
Right, right. A couple things came to mind. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right?
Yeah.
So there was a question in here about what the engagement meant. I think Sharon was going back to the HERE model that you gave. Do you want to really say what E for engagement meant?
So the E, it means focus on the speaker. So HALT is stopping, E is engaging. You're focusing on them. You're signaling to them that you are focusing on them. Yeah, so that's what the E means.
Okay, thank you. So it's 3:54. Are there any last comments or remarks or thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, so specifically around Aaron's question about what's the difference between equity and equality, I have a great little video. It's an illustrative cartoon video that answers exactly that question. What's the difference between equity and equality? It's on my website. It's on YouTube as well. And so I can figure out how to get you that link, or you can go to engineerinclusion.com and find it.
So
I use it as a teaching tool.
I will go back and tell our I was going to say our viewers, attendees. So if you come to this page on the PDF, at the very bottom, you will see your contact information. All of those links are clickable. So from the PDF, they can actually click on your information. It'll open up an email. It'll open up your website. It'll open up your LinkedIn profile, your Twitter. Try to make it easy.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
So you wanted to talk about that, and then you have a YouTube page that they can get to from your website.
Yeah, for sure. And I found the link here. I'll try to respond. I don't know if you can share links on here, but
I think you can definitely put it in that respond to the chat. And I will encourage everybody to go to your website, because Megan's got some awesome resources there. I'm not trying to sell you, but I think that there's some really great resources out there, and they can be really helpful for some. So thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, I do have tons of great resources that are free and meant for you to take, because somebody put a comment in the chat, like the people who are here, people who care about this, right? And sometimes, Aaron, you might be faced with like somebody else is asking that question. That's why I made these tools and these videos, so that you can be like, oh, I've got a great video for that. Click play. And so hopefully my website can be a great resource for lots of teaching tools like that. And if you do have a question that I don't have an answer for, let me know and I will make a video for you.
There you go. And so before I turn it back over to you, Aaron, I just want to invite everybody to join us. The series is every other Friday at 3 Eastern. Coming up in 2 weeks, Jessica Gilbert, she's a senior manager for talent, learning, and culture at Campbell Soup's snack division. And she's going to be talking. So this is sort of a follow-on of your session here, Megan. Specifically, what does that DEI leader bring then to the organization? And so with that, I thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Megan. We could have probably talked for hours.
For sure. It's so wonderful to meet all of you. I hope to connect with you again. It's wonderful to have this opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And so, Nathan, I'm turning it back to you to close us out.
Perfect. I'm actually going to launch our fourth and final poll.
Forgot about that one.
We'll leave that up. Give everybody a few seconds, but while we're doing that, Janah, Megan, thank you so much. It's a fantastic discussion, and there's so much interaction with the audience, and so many thank yous. I've been reposting all these great comments. Wonderful, excellent, thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Janah. Great information. So lots of these great comments just keep coming in, and I will keep reposting them. I'll leave this poll up for few more seconds. Just do the closing comments. So to our audience, thank you so much for attending. We'll do our best to get your CPE process a little later today. You should see it in your account by tomorrow. And we did record the session. We'll send you that archive link a little bit later today. Thank you so much, everyone. Hope to see you all at future webinars.